Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Shlomo Steinmetz, P&M Soft Support Team Leader, and today's webinar is about achieving intelligent business operations with sequence analytics. Our knowledge manager, Mr. Eli Stutz, will be presenting. Eli, why don't you get started?
Welcome, everybody. I'm Eli Stutz, Knowledge Manager for P&M Soft, and I'll be presenting today's webinar. Thank you very much, Shlomo. So the topic today, achieving intelligent business operations using real-time analytics. So the question is this: can a workflow make intelligent decisions? Now that's a question we're going to be answering today in this webinar. Let's get started by telling you what we'll be dealing with in the webinar. So in this webinar, we're going to be understanding what an intelligent workflow is and what benefits can intelligent workflows provide. We're going to take a look at 3 different paradigms of workflow intelligence. We're going to teach you how to use sequence real-time analytics in order to create intelligent workflows. And we're going to take a look at some examples of intelligent workflows which are built in sequence. Now, first off, what is an intelligent workflow? So the definition we'll be using today is that an intelligent workflow is a workflow which uses real-time analytics and data to make decisions or to assist user decisions by exposing that relevant data to the user. Now, why do we need intelligent workflows? Why do we need workflows that use real-time data in order to make their own decisions or to assist user decisions? So first of all, as we know in business, decision-making should be based on actual conditions and facts and not on intuition. And today's businesses have to deal with a ton of complex information and tasks, and people are often overloaded and systems are overloaded with too much information and too many tasks in order to make the right decision. It could be that the data does exist, the relevant data is there, but it's hard to access. It could be in different locations, it could be hard to interpret, or it could be mixed with data which is irrelevant. Finally, automating decisions based on the real-time data, the relevant data that you have, which is up to date, can save manual decisions, human decisions, and can thereby reduce error and save your business costs. So that's why we actually are driving towards intelligent workflows, which can make decisions based on real-time data. Now, to help us understand what we mean by an intelligent workflow, let's take a look at the difference between an unintelligent workflow and an intelligent workflow. An unintelligent workflow is a process which makes decisions that are either hard-coded or they're based on data which is out of date. Or it's a workflow which makes decisions exclusively by the user without actual assistance from the workflow itself. That's an unintelligent workflow. What do we mean by an intelligent workflow? An intelligent workflow makes decisions itself, or it shares that decision-making with the user, and in order to do this, brings up-to-date relevant data to the user. An intelligent workflow makes the decision-making of an intelligent workflow improves over time. It becomes optimized over time. An intelligent workflow's decisions are based on up-to-date analytical data. And finally, we're going to take a look at a situation where the workflow monitors real-time environmental conditions and factors and then prompts the user or other systems to make decisions when intervention is needed. Let's take a look at a first example in order to understand what we mean here. Let's take a look at a call center where we have a team of responders who are responding to customer calls. And as in any call center scenario, we can have situations where there's overload of calls and customers have to wait. So a call center workflow could monitor the average response time by the team. And if the average response time exceeds a certain limit, then the workflow will be smart enough to take compensative actions. Now let's take a look at the kind of actions that this intelligent workflow could take. First off, if the average response time exceeds a certain limit, the workflow could send an alert to the manager of the call center who may decide to call in more responders, more staff. The the workflow could alert team members to spend less time on each call in order to deal with the overload. Thirdly, the workflow could send a message to callers who are waiting that the time is longer than usual and suggest leaving a message and a callback number. And finally, and this is perhaps the most intelligent of all, the workflow could decide to route more calls to team members who are performing better, who are responding to their calls faster. Now, in order to do that, the workflow must have access to real-time data, the data which shows which responders are responding faster up until now. And using that data, the workflow can then decide where to route the calls. So that is actually we're going, as we go down in this chart here, we're going towards more intelligent response. Let's take a look at a second example of what we're talking about when we say intelligent workflows, a situation of a train dispatcher. We have a network of trains, and the train dispatcher controls where each train is at a specific time. It monitors where each train is, and it gives instructions to the conductors on how to move and when. Now, a train dispatcher workflow will check the actual train location against a schedule where the train is supposed to be. And as soon as a train is delayed, the workflow sees this and then will take several compensative actions. What kind of actions? Firstly, the workflow can alert conductors to use a modified course based on one train being delayed. Secondly, the workflow can alert passengers to the delay by a vocal message on the train. And thirdly, the workflow can tell a connecting train to wait until the delayed train arrives. And now fourthly, we get again to the most intelligent response, which is that the workflow can be aggregating data on the course which performed best in previous similar situations, because the train course has to be modified now that one train is delayed. The workflow now intelligently selects which course worked best last time, and now that course is selected this time. That's an intelligent decision based on up-to-date analytical data, and thus the workflow is actually improving over time. Now we're going to take a look in a moment at 3 different paradigms of workflow intelligence. Before we do that, I'd like to ask if there are any questions.
Just the one clarification, Ellie, about the workflow that routes calls to the quickest responder. Yes, of course, John. To answer your question, by doing that, you're changing the parameters and placing more load on the fastest responder. That'll push them down in the rating, and somebody else will come in first place and get more calls. So this will, of course, constantly change and get reevaluated whenever new action items are created.
Thank you very much, Shlomo. Let's take a look at 3 different paradigms of intelligent workflows. The first is the simplest. It's called decision optimization, and in this case, we'll be going back to the call center example. We have an incoming call, and then here the workflow has to make a decision who's going to get the call. So it checks real-time analytics. It checks who has the most calls waiting. It checks who's responding fastest to calls. And based on that real-time, up-to-date information, the workflow is going to decide who to send the call to responder A or responder B. So there we have paradigm 1, decision optimization. The workflow is independently making the correct decision based on real-time analytics. Now here's paradigm 2, assisting a user decision. Now here we have a case where the shift leader in the call center reports that there's excess call traffic. Now the workflow is going to take a look at the data, at the up-to-date analytics on what's going on in the call center, who has the most calls, which responder is performing best, how many minutes are people waiting, and then it's going to bring that information to the manager of the call center. It's going to expose that relevant information so that the manager can make an assisted decision which will be the best decision based on the up-to-the-date data. The decision could be to change the message to people who are waiting online. It could be to notify the people who are responding to calls to decrease the time that they spend with the customer in order to deal with the excess calls. Or it could be to summon more workers. And what the workflow has done here is it's bringing the relevant data to the manager, to the human user, in order to help to assist that user to make the correct decision. And this is obviously important when we have a complex decision which can't be made by the machine alone. The third paradigm is similar, and in this paradigm, though, the workflow is not kicked off by a user or another system. It's the system itself. The workflow itself is constantly monitoring the environment, the conditions, and notices when something out of the ordinary happens which needs to kick off the process. In this case, when we talk about a train dispatcher, the workflow is going to be monitoring all train positions, and as soon as it detects that a train is delayed, it's going to get into the decision thread. And here again we can have a situation where it checks the real-time information, looks at where the other trains are, it looks at what happened last time, what solution was chosen last time, and which solution worked best for the specific scenario. It can also bring in the manager of the system for a cooperative shared decision, bringing the manager that real-time relevant information, and then together the machine and the human are going to make a decision which will best fit the scenario, either to alert conductors and passengers, to tell a connecting train to wait, or to choose an optimal course from several courses. That's the third paradigm of workflow intelligence. Now, let's take a look at the benefits here that we've seen already. First of all, when we have an intelligent workflow, the decisions are going to be better. They're going to be better because they're based on real-time data. They're going to be better because when you make a decision based on what's actually going on around you, it's going to be a better, more informed decision. Second of all, we're going to have workflows which actually improve over time because they learn from past mistakes. They're like a human who learns over time. We have now a workflow which looks back at what was chosen last time and from all the choices that were chosen in the previous times decides to choose the one which works best. That's actually learning and optimizing over time. We have greater visibility of our environment. We have the bringing of relevant real-time data to users, to the human operators of the workflow, in order to make the informed decision based on the conditions. And finally, we have monitoring of the environment and better reaction to exceptional events which require attention. Now let's take it into sequence. Now, PNMsoft Sequence has some very simple and powerful capabilities to create intelligent workflows. Primarily, what we're going to now focus on in this part of the webinar is Sequence's statistics feature, because this is a feature which collects and aggregates real-time data and metadata of workflows as they run. And as we said earlier, a very important element of creating intelligent workflow is using real-time data. So this is a feature which actually helps us gather that data, and we're going to use it in order to create some intelligent workflows. Now, this data is collected by default every 10 minutes, and that's configurable by Sequence's background runtime service. And also, I should mention that you can set the history interval for how often this data is saved to the Sequence database, and this is used later for reports, for trends on this data over time. Now let's take a look at how it works in Sequence. Give me 1 second. we're going to actually cover 4 different areas of how sequence analytics and the statistics feature can be used. We're going to see how it can be used inside business rules, inside visual alerts to the user, as conditions in the message recipient's dialog box, and in order to create charts and reports. Those are the 4 areas inside sequence where we're going to implement the sequence analytics feature. Now I'm going to move over to sequence, and I'm going to show you some examples of how we create intelligent workflows in sequence using the statistics feature. The first one is an expense report, and let's move over to sequence now. Now I want to point out that the examples that I'm going to show you are simplified examples which are intended to give over a point, to make a point on how to create intelligent workflows. They're not full or complete workflows. These are just to give you ideas of how to use this concept in your organization. So here we're going to take a look at a very simple expense form workflow where an employee is filling out a form of items, of an expense form which he wants approved by his manager, of items that he's purchased. He wants the purchases approved. And this first part of the workflow, the first activity, is a very simple form. And we're going to see this in runtime in a moment. But this is a form which enables the employee to fill out his expenses and then send them into a manager for approval. The second form, we'll get to it in a second, is the task which where the manager basically approves these items. It's a director approval. Take a look at that. And here we have the details of the expense report and the approval of the manager on that expense report. Now, I've already set up a condition here. Now, what's a condition? When does the form go to director approval? It goes to director approval when the total expense requested by the employee is greater than the average total expenses that were requested by employees using this workflow up until now. And the average of that total is actually a statistic. And let me show you how that was created. If you click in the workflow editor and then you click on the advanced button beside statistics, then here's where you create your statistics for the workflow. I've already created a statistic called average department expense, which calculates the average expenses requested in each of these workflows. I can edit it, and we'll create a new one together in a second. But this basically takes the expense form total amount of expenses and does an average on it over all the workflow instances. Now let's create one of our own just to see how easy it is. Click on Advanced beside Statistics. Now I click Create. And now I create a new one by clicking New. Let's call it, for simplicity's sake, Sum Total Expense. And this is going to do a sum on the expenses requested in this workflow. So here you can see in the middle part of the wizard we have the fields, and we have mathematical functions which we can use. We saw the average before. Here we're going to use the sum. So I click inside this panel, click Sum, double-click Sum, and then the parameter of the sum is going to be the total amount. And let's validate that expression. It's validated, and now I save it. And now we have a new statistic, which is the sum, which can also be used. Now let's take a look at how it actually works in the runtime. Okay, so here's our expense report. Let's run it. I'm going to add 2 expenses. Okay, as you can see, here's the total expenses in the expense report. And here actually I've added a field of the average expense, so you can see where we are. And this field is actually using that statistic. The default value of this field is the statistic itself. And here when I click update, the form is going directly to the director for approval because the total exceeded the average on all the previous workflows. So now the director can decide whether or not to approve this expense request. Now, how did I use the statistic in the condition? Let's take a look at that. In the if-else condition, this is where I added in our statistic. So I asked, is the total amount of expenses in this workflow greater than the average over all previous workflows? And here I added in our statistic, which is easily accessible in the fields area through the metadata of the workflow in the statistics area here. These are my statistics which I've created for the workflow. So I've simply double-clicked and added that in to the if-else condition here and added in workflow statistics average expense. Now, as I mentioned, statistics can be used in several places within Sequence. And we'll go through them in a second, but first I'd like to open the field and ask if there are any questions until now.
Thank you, Eli. There are three quick questions that I wanted to cover. The first one, the frequency of the statistics calculation is a trade-off between how up-to-date you want the information to be. Of course, you want it to be as new and as close to the edge as possible. And on the other hand, performance. Because while here we have a one or two simple statistics expressions that are working on a small workflow, you could theoretically have 0 to n amount of statistics expressions per workflow template, and a large amount of and millions of workflow instances, and the calculation could be heavy. So it's always a trade-off between up-to-dateness and performance. The second question is the average. Of course, the expression over here is the average of all workflows, and you could, of course, add a where clause to limit it to the last whatever quarter or month or however to keep the data up-to-date and sharp. And lastly, of course, the average field would be hidden in the real workflow. We don't want people to see what they're working up against. Just a second. Is there anything else? Okay, so last two questions. The interval is, again, how often is it calculated and written into the database? By default, it's 10 minutes, right?
It's calculated every 10 minutes by the background runtime service, and it's written to the history tables by default daily, and you can change that to weekly or yearly. Sorry, monthly or yearly.
Okay. And lastly, can statistics be computed from external data? Not really. It's what you have in the tree. There's whatever you have inside the workflow information. Other kind of statistics, there are alternatives using SQL-based expressions or other ideas, but the basic statistics functionality is meant for workflow data.
Okay, so what we've seen here is we've seen a workflow which is using up-to-date analytical data on the workflow in order to make a decision. And that actually follows the first paradigm that we took a look at earlier. One moment. The first paradigm, which was making a decision based on real-time analytics, where the workflow itself is making that decision. Now, Sequence you can use the statistics which you've collected in several places. Now, we saw how to use it just now inside the if-else condition, as part of a business rule. That's one place you can use the statistics which you've created. Another place which I briefly mentioned is in the default value of a field in a form. You can also use statistics there, and here this is an example of that. I've used that in order to show, as Shlomo correctly mentioned, in a hidden field, but we may want to expose this to the manager perhaps, maybe not to the employee. So you can use the statistics as a default value in a field of a form. You can use it in a condition which is also a condition which determines where a message is sent, as in it determines the message recipient. You can use it there as well. And finally, you can use it in order to create a chart. Let's take a quick look at that. Now here in the monitoring tables, we have a chart which I've created called average expense total. And this chart is using the statistic which we created, the average department expenses, in order to display that information on the average department expenses in an angular chart. And let's take a look at that chart. Okay, we could have a chart which shows various areas, low, medium, high, and this statistic is now being displayed here in the angular chart. Let's take a look at another example, another way of using statistics in sequence. We're going to take a look at an example of a credit request in which the statistic is actually being used in order to detect fraud detection. So imagine a bank where everything is automated, everything is online, and we have the ability to, for a new customer to fill in a request for credit, or existing customer to fill in a request for credit. Here it is. Here's the form. And for argument's sake, Harold's address is ABC123, and this is just a simplified example. And he's requesting some credit. Let's see what happens now. This is going to the manager for approval. And this is the approval task which has been sent to the manager. But let's take a look at this alert. Fraud alert. This address has appeared 9 times. Consider reporting to fraud detection. So what the workflow has done here is it has been aggregating data up until now on the previous workflow instances, and it notices that this address has been used several times for different users, for different people, and this clearly is suspicious, and we're using this data, this real-time data, to bring up an alert to the manager, to the bank manager, hey, this address has appeared 9 times, possible fraud. So what the workflow has done in this case is it's using data which it's aggregating in real time in order to bring relevant information to a stakeholder, to a user in the system, and enable that user to use that relevant information in order to make a better informed decision. So in this case, we're using a statistic in order to generate an alert. And if you'd like to see the actual behind the scenes, how exactly this is done, I invite you to contact us after the webinar. I'm not going to go into detail in each of the next examples, but there is the example of the alert to the user. Next example is we have a purchase request. Now here we have a company which is purchasing an item, and it can purchase that item from 3 different providers. And it's going to, and the person in the company is going to fill out a form, which is going to go to one of the providers using this workflow. Now, the workflow intelligence comes into play here, in that the workflow is going to send the request to the provider out of the 3 providers which has performed the best, which has the fastest turnaround time up until now. So in this case, the workflow has chosen provider C because it's been aggregating the data on how each provider has performed up till now, and then it chooses the provider who is performing the best. It's actually doing a statistic which is very simply taking the difference in time between the time that the request is sent to to a provider and the time that the request has been filled, has been completed. And now it has that very relevant, up-to-date information and will decide on its own, in the condition of the message recipients, to send this task to the provider who performs the best. So again, here we have a case where the workflow is using the up-to-date data in order to make the best decision. And of course, this is something which is improving over time because the providers will be given clearly incentivized to perform better, and we're going to get better performance in general from the system. Now, the case which I mentioned earlier of fraud detection, that was a case of our second paradigm, of an assisted user decision, where the workflow is bringing real-time analytics in order to assist the decision. Let's take a look at an example. Let's take a look at a fourth example here of a support ticket scenario where we have a support team which is receiving support tickets from customers, and this is a form which enables the customer to lodge a support ticket. Customer fills this out, gives a little description, and then the customer will define the severity of the case. Now this goes to the leader of the support team for triage, for analysis of what to do with the ticket, where to send it to. And here, the workflow is going to assist the support leader in making the decision on how to assess the severity of the case. How is the workflow going to help the support leader? By bringing statistical data into a chart. Now, we just clicked on a link to severity history, and this brings up a chart to the leader of the support team, which shows the history on that particular client. What severity have they chosen in the past? Now, let's say this client has chosen an overwhelming majority of times that this ticket is in a high severity level. This is going to influence the decision of the support team leader. Maybe if every case is high, if every case is high, then perhaps the support team leader will choose low or medium here based on that history. And the way that we put that chart together was, as I showed you earlier, in the chart, in the tables of the sequence administration, we inserted the statistic into the chart. And here again, we have an example of an assisted user decision where the workflow is assisting the support team leader to make the right decision based on up-to-date data. So that's our second paradigm right there. Do we have any questions, Shlomo? Okay, and we have time for one more example. Here, let's take a look at an example of a tender evaluation. Let's say we have a petrochemical company which receives tenders on a frequent basis and has to decide whether to compete for them. Now, this may be filled in by a secretary or someone who's inputting the information about the tender, or may be filled in automatically. This is just a simplified example. And now it goes to a manager in the petrochemical company who has to decide whether or not to compete for the tender. So we have an alert here that the workflow has brought up for that manager that the petrochemical company has won 4 tenders out of 10 in this category. So here the manager has been given up-to-date information, up-to-date analytics on what's happened up until now, and will then decide based on that whether to compete for the tender or not. So again, we have an example of an assisted user decision. So we've seen 5 examples now of how Sequence enables you to create workflows which are indeed intelligent, which either make their own decisions based on up-to-date data or assist user decisions based on up-to-date data. So it's very easy to do this in Sequence. The tools are simple and very easy to put into your workflows. Let's do a sum up. An intelligent workflow is a workflow which uses real-time analytics to optimize its behavior. We looked at 3 basic paradigms of workflow intelligence. We understood that intelligent workflows can improve performance and handle complex situations and scenarios. And finally, we've seen how PNMsoft's Sequence provides simple and powerful tools to implement intelligent workflows. Any further questions? Well, that wraps up today's webinar. I thank you very much for joining us. Once again, for more information about Sequence, you can check out our website or our member site and consult also our great support team. I want to thank you, Shlomo, and thank you all for joining us. And of course, the webinar will be available on our website and on our members site. And we look forward to joining you for future webinars. I'm Eli Stutz, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Muted.